Long ago, near the fertile plains of the Jordan, there stood two famous cities called Sodom and Gomorrah. From a distance, they looked beautiful, rich, and full of life. Their markets were busy, their homes were grand, and their streets were crowded with people. But beneath all that beauty, darkness had taken root in the hearts of many. People cared little for God, little for justice, and little for mercy. They lived for pleasure, power, and selfish desire. Far away, Abraham, a man who walked closely with God, had once watched his nephew Lot choose to live near those cities. At the time, the land had looked green and promising. "It seems like a good place to settle," Lot had said years before. But now that choice was about to lead his family into great danger. Lot had made his home in Sodom and had become an important man in the city. He often sat at the city gate, where leaders and respected men gathered to talk and settle matters. Though he lived among the people of Sodom, his heart was often troubled by what he saw around him. Day after day, he witnessed cruelty, arrogance, and acts that dishonored God. Still, he remained there with his wife and daughters, trying to live quietly in a city that had lost its way. One evening, as the sun began to sink and shadows stretched across the gate, Lot noticed two strangers approaching the city. They looked like ordinary travelers, dusty from the road and weary from a journey. Lot rose quickly and bowed with respect. "My lords," he said kindly, "please come to my house and spend the night." The strangers looked at him carefully, as if measuring both his words and his heart. At first, the visitors answered him, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But Lot's face tightened with concern. He knew the city too well, and he knew the danger that came after dark. "No," he urged him again, "please do not stay in the open. Come under my roof. Let me wash your feet and prepare food for you." There was an urgency in his voice that could not be ignored. The two men finally agreed and followed him to the streets of Sodom. Inside his house, Lot quickly prepared a meal for them, and his family welcomed them in. As they sat together, the strangers watched everything with quiet eyes. Lot tried to act calm, but something heavy pressed on his spirit that night. It felt as if the city itself was holding its breath before a storm. Before they could lie down to sleep, loud voices suddenly rose outside the house. The noise grew stronger until it sounded like a mob had gathered at Lot's door. Men from every part of the city had surrounded the house, young and old alike. They shouted wickedly and pounded on the entrance. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they cried. "Bring them out to us." Lot's heart dropped as fear gripped him. He stepped outside and shut the door behind him, trying to protect his guests. "Please, my brothers," he pleaded, "do not do such evil." But the crowd was already burning with violence and would not listen to reason. The men of the city pushed closer, their faces twisted with anger. "Stand back," they shouted at Lot. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he acts like our judge." Their words were sharp and full of hatred. Lot realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. The crowd surged forward, ready to break down the door and harm everyone inside. But in a sudden moment, the two visitors reached out from inside the house, pulled Lot back in, and shut the door behind him. Then they struck the men outside with blindness. The mob stumbled and groped around in confusion, still trying to find the doorway, though they could no longer see it. Inside the house, Lot stood trembling, staring at the two men in shock. These were no ordinary travelers, and the night had only just begun. The two visitors turned to Lot with a seriousness that filled the room. "Do you have anyone else here?" they asked. "Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone belonging to you in the city?" Lot hesitated for a moment, his mind racing through the faces of his family. "Yes, my daughters are promised in marriage," he replied. "Then go quickly," the men said. "Bring them out of this place." Their voices were firm and urgent. "We are about to destroy this city, because the outcry against its people has grown great before God." Lot felt his heart pound in his chest. Destroy the city? Everything he had built, everything he knew. It was all about to end. Yet deep inside, he knew the warning was true. Without wasting another moment, Lot rushed out into the night. The streets were still restless, but the blinded crowd had begun to scatter in confusion. Lot hurried to the houses of the men who were engaged to his daughters. He knocked urgently, calling out their names. "Get up," he said breathlessly. "You must leave this place at once." They looked at him with sleepy confusion. "The city is going to be destroyed," Lot continued. "God is going to judge it." But the men exchanged glances and began to laugh. "He must be joking," one of them said. Lot stood there desperate, but they refused to believe him. The night slowly gave way to the first light of dawn, and the air felt heavy with tension. Back in the house, the two angels urged Lot again. "Hurry," they said. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." But Lot hesitated. He looked around at his home, at the life he was about to leave behind. Fear and attachment held him in place. So the angels took hold of his hand and the hands of his wife and daughters. By the mercy of God, they led them out of the city. Lot stumbled along, still trying to understand everything that was happening. The morning sky was growing brighter, but judgment was drawing near. As soon as they were safely outside the city, one of the angels spoke again. "Run for your lives," he commanded. "Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be destroyed." Lot, still shaken, looked toward the distant hills. "My lords," he said, "please, I cannot escape to the mountains. The disaster may overtake me, and I will die." He pointed toward a small town nearby. "Look, that town is close enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee there. Please, let me go there so I can live." The angel considered his request carefully. "Very well," he replied. "I will grant this favor also. But hurry," the angel added. "I cannot do anything until you reach that place." The small town was called Zor. Lot gathered his family, and they began to run as fast as they could. The sun was rising over the horizon, casting light across the land. Behind them, Sodom and Gomorrah stood unaware of what was about to happen. Lot's heart raced as his feet pounded against the ground. "Do not look back." The warning echoed in his mind again and again. His daughters clung close, fear written across their faces. His wife followed behind, but something in her heart still lingered in the city they were leaving behind. And in that moment, the fate of many was sealed. Then it happened. As Lot and his family fled toward Zor, judgment fell from heaven. The Lord rained down burning sulfur and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Flames burst across the cities, and smoke rose into the sky like a furnace. The rich homes, the crowded streets, the marketplaces, and the fields were all swallowed in destruction. The cries of the people were drowned by the roar of fire and collapsing stone. Everything that had seemed strong and secure was brought down in a moment. Lot ran forward in terror. Hearing the ruin behind him, his daughters wept as the ground itself seemed to shake beneath them. The day of mercy had ended, and the day of judgment had come. Behind Lot, his wife struggled with what she was leaving behind. Her home, her memories, her possessions, her old life, it all remained in the city. Though the warning had been clear, her heart was divided. She slowed her steps and turned her head. Just one glance, just one look behind. But that single act of disobedience changed everything. At that moment, she became a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters cried out in horror, but there was no time to go back. The command had been given, and the judgment was still falling. With broken hearts, they had no choice but to keep running. Far away, Abraham rose early that morning and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. The day before, he had pleaded for Sodom, asking if God would spare the city for the sake of the righteous. What if there are 50 righteous people there? Abraham had asked. Then he had asked again and again, lowering the number each time. What about 45? 40? 30? 20? 10? And the Lord had answered each time, "If I find that many, I will spare it." Now Abraham stood silently, looking out over the plain. What he saw made his heart sink. Smoke was rising from the land like smoke from a great furnace. The answer was clear. There had not even been 10 righteous people there. Yet in the middle of judgment, God had remembered mercy. He had remembered Abraham and rescued Lot from catastrophe. Lot and his daughters reached Zoar safely, but peace did not fill Lot's heart. The small town gave him shelter, but fear still followed him like a shadow. Every time he looked toward the sky, he remembered the flames. Every time he thought of the plain, he remembered his wife. The city that once seemed full of promise was now nothing but ash and silence. Lot had escaped with his life, but everything else had been stripped away. His wealth, his home, his standing, and part of his family were all gone. He was a survivor, but he was also a broken man. After some time, Lot became afraid to remain in Zoar, though the town had been spared. His heart no longer trusted the safety of any city. So he took his 2 daughters and left Zoar behind. Together, they climbed into the mountains and found shelter in a cave. It was a bitter ending for a man who had once lived among the wealth of the Jordan plain. Now he sat in darkness with only his daughters beside him. The wind howled outside the cave, and the silence inside felt heavy. His daughters looked at him and at each other, their future suddenly uncertain. Their world had been shattered, and they could not see a clear way forward. What happened next would become another painful chapter in Lot's troubled story. One evening, as they sat in the cave, the older daughter spoke in a worried voice. "Our father is old," she said, "and there is no man around here for us to marry, as is the custom of the earth." Her younger sister listened quietly, troubled by the same fear. The destruction of the cities had left them isolated and afraid. They believed their family line might end with them. So the older daughter proposed a desperate and deeply wrong plan. "Come," she said, "let us make our father drink wine, and then we will lie with him so that we may preserve our family line through him." The younger daughter looked at her in shock. "You cannot mean that," she whispered. But fear had already begun to twist their judgment. That night, they gave Lot wine until he became drunk. His grief and weakness had already worn him down, and now his senses were clouded. When he could no longer think clearly, the older daughter carried out the terrible plan. Lot was unaware of what was happening. The cave, once a place of refuge, became a place of shame. By morning, silence hung heavily in the air. Lot did not realize what had taken place. The older daughter looked at her sister and said, "Last night I lay with our father. Tonight we will do the same again so that both of you may have children." The younger daughter stared at her, torn between fear and conscience. But instead of turning away, she agreed. The second night, they gave Lot wine again. Once more, he lost awareness of what was happening around him. And once more, Sin entered the cave under the cover of darkness. By the end of those nights, both daughters had become pregnant by their father. What began as fear had led to a tragic and sinful decision. Rather than trusting God for their future, they had taken matters into their own hands. The consequences of that choice would stretch far beyond their own lives. It was a sad reminder that leaving a wicked city does not always mean leaving its influence behind. Sodom had been destroyed, but traces of its corruption still lingered in Lot's family. The fire outside had ended, but the damage inside the heart remained. In time, the older daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab. He became the father of the Moabites, a people who would later have a long and troubled history with Israel. The younger daughter also gave birth to a son and named him Ben-Ammi. He became the father of the Ammonites. These 2 nations would one day stand as neighbors and often enemies of Abraham's descendants. Generations later, their names would appear again and again in Israel's story. What happened in that cave did not remain hidden forever. Its effects spread through history like ripples across water. A single night of fear-driven sin had planted seeds for future conflict, and Lot's family would carry that burden for years to come. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah became more than just a story about cities destroyed by fire. It became a warning about what happens when people reject truth, justice, and the fear of God. It also became a warning about compromise. Lot had not started as a wicked man, but he had chosen to live too close to corruption. Over time, that environment shaped his home, his choices, and the pain his family would later carry. Still, the story also revealed the mercy of God. Even in the middle of judgment, he had reached out and rescued Lot. He had listened to Abraham's prayer and remembered his mercy. And through the ashes of destruction, one truth remained. God sees both the wickedness of men and the cries of the righteous. Nothing escapes his eyes, and no choice is ever without consequence. Years passed, but the memory of Sodom and Gomorrah did not disappear. Travelers who crossed the region would speak in hushed tones about the land near the Dead Sea. Some said the earth there looked cursed, barren, and lifeless. Others pointed to the ruins and whispered, "This is what remains of the cities God judged." Parents told the story to their children as a warning. Do not become proud, they would say. Do not mock what is right. The names Sodom and Gomorrah became symbols of rebellion and destruction. What had once been wealthy and admired was now remembered only for its downfall. Their beauty had faded, but their lesson remained. And generation after generation, the story continued to echo. For Abraham, the destruction of the cities was not merely news from a distant land. It was personal. His nephew Lot had once stood beside him, walked with him, and shared in the blessings God had given. Abraham likely remembered the day Lot had chosen the green plain, thinking it was the better path. At the time, it had seemed wise and practical. But not every place that looks fruitful is truly safe. Not every opportunity leads to peace. Abraham understood this now more deeply than ever. A land can look like paradise on the outside and still hide spiritual ruin underneath. And some choices cost far more than they first appear. Lot, too, would never forget what happened. He had entered Sodom seeking prosperity, but he had left it with almost nothing. The city had offered him comfort, influence, and status, but in the end, it could not save him. Its gates, its walls, and its wealth all failed in the hour of judgment. He had escaped with his life, yet his losses were painful beyond words. He lost his home. He lost his wife. He lost the sons-in-law who refused to listen. And even after surviving, he carried wounds that would follow him for the rest of his days. The city had not only surrounded him, it had marked his family deeply. That is one of the deepest warnings in Lot's story. A person does not need to join in every evil around him to still be harmed by living too close to it. At first, Lot only looked towards Sodom. Later, he pitched his tents near it. Then he moved into it. Eventually, his entire household was shaped by its atmosphere. Its values crept into his family little by little, until the damage became impossible to ignore. Sin rarely announces its full danger at the beginning. It often arrives dressed as comfort, success, or harmless compromise. And by the time many realize the cost, the roots have already gone deep. Still, even in such a dark story, the mercy of God shines through. God did not owe Lot a rescue, yet he sent angels to pull him out. When Lot hesitated, the angels took him by the hand. That small detail reveals something powerful. Sometimes people are too weak, too fearful, or too confused to save themselves. And in those moments, God's mercy reaches down and leads them out. Lot was not rescued because he was strong. He was rescued because God was merciful. Even in a story full of fire and judgment, mercy was still moving quietly in the middle of it all. That is a truth worth remembering. The story also reveals something serious about the character of God. He is patient, but he is not blind. He gives people time to repent, but he does not ignore evil forever. For years, Sodom and Gomorrah had filled themselves with pride, violence, cruelty, and wickedness. Their sin had risen like a cry to heaven. And when the time came, God answered with justice. This truth can make people uncomfortable, but it cannot be erased from the story. God is loving, but he is also holy. He is merciful, but he is also just. And one day, every hidden thing will be brought into the light. Later in Scripture, prophets and teachers would look back on Sodom and Gomorrah as a warning to future generations. Their fall became a picture of what happens when people harden themselves against God. Yet it also became a call to humility and repentance. The lesson was never meant to be, look how bad they were. The lesson was, take care that your own heart does not drift the same way. It is easy to point at a ruined city. It is harder to examine the quiet compromises inside one's own life. That is why this story has never stopped speaking. Its fire may have gone out long ago, but its warning still burns. And every generation must decide whether it will listen. Imagine the silence that must have settled over the plain after the flames died down. No shouting in the streets. No merchants calling from the markets. No music, no feasting, no proud voices boasting of tomorrow. Only smoke, ash, and the emptiness left behind. The cities that once laughed at righteousness were now silent before the judgment of God. And somewhere far from the ruins, Lot sat in the mountains, staring at the sky and remembering it all. He had seen what sin can do when it is allowed to grow unchecked. He had seen how quickly the things of this world can vanish. And those memories would never leave him. Yet above the smoke, above the fear, and above the tragedy, one truth remained unshaken. God had spoken, and his word had stood firm. What he had warned, he had done. What he had promised, he had fulfilled. That same truth carries through every generation. Human beings may ignore God for a season, but his truth does not bend to human opinion. Cities rise and fall. Cultures change. People celebrate what is wrong and reject what is right. But the voice of God remains steady through it all. And in the end, his word will always outlast the pride of men. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah remains one of the Bible's most sobering and unforgettable warnings. It is a story of sin, compromise, mercy, judgment, and the high cost of ignoring God. It reminds every reader that where a person chooses to live, what a person chooses to tolerate, and how a person responds to God truly matters. It warns that wickedness may appear strong for a time, but it never escapes the eyes of heaven. And yet, it also offers this hope. God still knows how to rescue those who belong to him. Even when the world around them is collapsing, his mercy can still reach them. That is why this ancient story still speaks with power today, not only as a memory of what happened long ago, but as a living warning for every generation. And for those willing to listen, its message is clear. Flee from destruction, cling to truth, and never look back. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the Golden Bible Story page on YouTube. Follow on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. God bless you.